Welcome, friends, to Uncommon Voices, Uncommon Visions. I'm your host, Dr. Valerie Nyberg, and this is episode 10. With me today is a good friend of mine, Dr. Kimberly Granderson. She's currently a school psychologist at the Aspire Public Schools. Her two sites are the Port City Academy, which is a TK5, and the Langston Hughes Academy, which is a 6 through 12. Dr. Granderson, so nice to have you on. Thank you so much for coming on today.
It's great to be here. I'm excited to have a conversation with you. And yes, I'm currently working as a school psychologist in Stockton, California with Aspire Public Schools, which is an organization that has charter schools located throughout all of California, the Central Valley, the Bay Area, and Los Angeles.
Wow. Wow. How many schools do they have?
Approximately, I think now we have about 33 schools.
Okay.
Yeah,
And how
with
many students do you think that the serves?
the last records that I saw about that was about 30,000, maybe a little bit more students before the pandemic. And then after the pandemic, it might be a little less.
Yeah. A lot of schools saw a lot of movement in student populations because of the pandemic and new online opportunities to have
hmm
schooling. Well, that's really fascinating. So in your job as a school psychologist, what kinds of things do you do?
So my day to day kind of differs. And so because I'm at a TK through 12 site, and they're both on one campus,
Okay.
it can range from anything from intervening with a kid who's having a meltdown or who's made a threat assessment, all the way up to doing some teacher collaboration with a high school teacher or a middle school teacher around helping a student cope in class. So it varies to the point where I'm sometimes just in my office doing paperwork and pulling kids for testing and finishing reports. So it can vary to talking to parents around what they're seeing with their students and what kind of supports their students might need on campus, different things like that. Meeting with administrators and going over systems that we have in place and that we want to better.
Okay, awesome. So I am, as an administrator, I've worked with school psychologists mostly in the development or the process of IEPs or looking for issues that students are having learning wise. Can you kind of delineate for us the difference between like a school psychologist, a school counselor, and any kind of mental health supports that a school might have, just for folks who might not necessarily have a good handle on those differences?
I love that question because there's so much confusion sometimes around, oh, you're the school psychologist or you're the school counselor, the guidance counselor, or
Right.
are you a mental health counselor? And so with school psychology, it varies depending on the program you went through.
Mhm.
And so you can vary from being someone who just does testing and
Okay.
works with schools doing pre-referral processes, SSTs, meeting with parents and helping implement an IEP. You can be involved in counseling, individual counseling or group counseling certain students.
Mhm.
And so that's where that overlap comes with the school counselor, whereas the school counselor mostly is doing gen ed counseling with students who need some brief counseling, who are going through some things at home or experiencing some anxiety or different concerns or problems, and they do a brief counseling sessions with them for approximately maybe 6 weeks. A
Mhm.
student with an IEP, we've identified that there's a longer term concern or problem, and so we may work with them for the whole school year for several years. And with Aspire, what we have done as of late is that the school psychologist is more in the line of testing, helping with implementing IEPs, helping with intervention, the MTSS process, and that's multi-tiered systems of supports. So that's looking at behavior, looking at social emotional learning, positive behavior supports, and things like that, and helping get systems together for students and schools. And we've brought in what we call mental health counselors who are MFTs or LCSWs who are coming in, and they're doing the counseling services for a lot of our IEP students. And then a lot of the Aspire schools have general ed counselors as well. And so we have these tiers of supports that help the student at all levels, starting at the gen ed level, doing universal tracking and universal programs, and then moving to that next tier of support when that's not working.
I love that. I know that especially at the secondary level, MTSS is such a hard thing to wrap your hands around. There's, you need a very wide team in many cases to kind of break things down into more discrete pieces and then put a system in place. So you did mention in your introduction that you have worked with teachers on interventions. Can you give us an example of that? Because I think that's something I haven't necessarily seen a lot of in my schools.
So we may recommend, we're in a pre-referral process and before a student gets to the special education setting. And so we're saying that we want a teacher to go back and go into the classroom and take some data and track an intervention that we've recommended that they put in place prior to moving a student to special education. So if it's a student that is showing symptoms of hyperactivity or symptoms of inattention, we may tell a teacher, we would like you to go in and put in place using fidgets with this student, using breaks with this student. We want you to track this data and watch over the next 3 to 4 weeks how this student how this system may work with this student, how it's implemented. And so I've gone into the classroom, I've done observations, and then met with the teacher afterwards and said, okay, this is what I see happening. This is what could happen differently. This is what I notice in the environment. The classroom may be a little busy, may need a little more structure with transitioning from unstructured time to structured time, and that's recess to back to reading, or the student might need less stimulation from the walls around them. And so let's try moving their seat and away from the window so they're not distracted by the playground and people walking past. Or let's put them near a more supportive peer who is on task and can help them remain on task, things like that. And so I've met with teachers and helped implement some of these things in the classroom, and then afterwards going back in and monitoring and helping go over like what happened, how did that work, and if it's not me that goes into the classroom, it's someone from our support team, so from our RTI team or our MTSS team going in and actually helping get this implemented and started for the teacher.
Yeah, and RTI being response to intervention.
Yes.
Yes.
And I will say this is a lot easier at the TK through 5 level than it is, like you said, at the secondary level.
Why do you think that is?
I think there's such a shift when you get to secondary of the mindset of less like supports in the classroom and more of, okay, they're struggling more than we can support. And we have an agenda of getting credits and getting them to this next level of schooling, post-secondary, or ready for the real world, that teacher mindset shifts and there's a lot less willingness to work with the things that you're seeing in the classroom and more of I think they need more targeted support from a specialist.
So to paraphrase and correct me if I'm wrong, I don't want to put words in your mouth. What I'm hearing is also what I've seen is there's a shift from a very humanistic way of looking at the whole child in the pre-K 5, 6 to looking at the child as a consumer or a product that we're kind of putting out, that we're not necessarily looking at the whole child, but just that portion of what we're responsible for as the classroom teacher.
I would say that, and then you have also, like you said, looking at the portion of the child we're responsible for. You have more teachers when you move into the middle school or high school setting, and so multiple people are seeing this one student, or the student seeing multiple teachers at one time throughout the day, and so you got math block, you have your ELA block, English language arts, you have your science and your history, and so because I specialize in this subject, this is where my focus is. And my focus is on also the 5 blocks I might have throughout the day.
Right. The content.
and
Right.
and so I don't always I see that student for maybe 90 minutes or less in that block. And if that student can't focus or can't participate within the general education curriculum at that time, in that 90 minutes in that one day, then I'm more apt to say, okay, this is tougher for this student. They need more targeted support than I'm able to offer because someone else can see them for longer periods of time more often and it's more consistent.
Yeah, I think our secondary, I think we've hit the point in our educational system that our secondary, the way it's structured, no longer serves for the teachers or for the students. Because when you're seeing 180 kids or even 140 kids, that's a lot to try to manage every day between the content and the, what each individual student needs, creating
Hmm.
that environment, that culture and supportive environment for all those kids is
Hmm.
really difficult, and it's only becoming more and more difficult.
I agree. The traditional sense of school,
Mhm.
quote unquote, bring them in, we educate as many of them as we can in this one little setting, is quickly having to change and shift. And as we know, education does not move fast at all. changes
Absolutely.
changes do not happen overnight. It takes lots of time and it takes lots of push because there's so much involved in it, so much politics, as well as the parents mindset, the community's mindset, the students mindset, the teachers mindset. All of that comes into play when we're looking at what do we need to focus on, what do we need to do to instruct these students and to see this whole child and get them through this 12 years.
Right,
Yeah.
right. So as we were preparing for this conversation, we've kind of gone a little of everywhere, which is of course, I love. You were talking about something that's caught your attention is the degree to which you see students who are not able to cope with difficulties and disappointments. Can you share with us an example of how you've seen this play out for students and their academics?
So I've been with Aspire now for about 14 years. And what I've noticed over time is that there's been a shift in the mindset of a student is doing well or a student is failing or a student is struggling, doing well or their student is struggling. And what I've noticed is that one little setback, my student got a B, my student is getting C's and D's, and it becomes this issue of um, great challenge for that student.
Uh-huh.
They are experiencing greater levels of anxiety, or they're experiencing things in the home that are spilling over into the school more often. And while kids are resilient, I see this more in the adults around them
Mm.
than the kids, that there's this worry that this one little thing that is going on or that happened, this D, this C, this parent being ill, or a distant family member having passed away
Mhm.
that we don't really have a whole lot of contact with, has impacted my child so much that they're going to struggle in the classroom.
Mhm.
They're going to struggle when they go to school, or they're struggling at home, um, even to the point where kids are, where parents are, I think, sometimes placing their own fears and
Mhm.
their own anxieties and worries on a child, because they're dealing with something. And so I'm seeing more hypervigilance around anxiety, around depression, and that the kids aren't always able to cope with it because there's this external force coming at them saying that, oh, you must be feeling this way.
Yeah, I think I've noticed the vocabulary of kids has changed considerably. I don't think I ever knew anything about anxiety when I was a teenager, yet a student can now tell you all kinds of things about anxiety and all kinds of warning signs about anxiety. But that, I mean, that's a double-edged sword. It's good to have that information, but it's also, you can also misuse it too. So
Mm-hmm.
can you talk about the fine line of when you have a student who's using that language but it's not necessarily using it appropriately, how we can identify that kind of situation, and then walk that kid and maybe that parent through what really is going on.
That's a really good question. I had a student recently who she has termed herself neurodivergent.
Yeah,
And
that's a
I'm
perfect
on
example.
and some of the terminology that the student would use would be, I was on Mayo Clinic, I was on WebMD, I was on TikTok, and I have all the symptoms of major depressive disorder, or I have all the symptoms of neurodiversity. I'm neurodivergent because I don't believe this and I don't believe that, or this is what's going on with me. And they're able to list off a list of symptomology that you're like, well, that's really interesting that you're able to, be that aware of this disorder within yourself at this age.
Right.
And so walking, I would tell parents, being careful what you're letting your students watch, being careful with how you yourself handle your anxiety, and how you show a student how to handle any type of disorder, even if it's a severe illness that you may have. How are you dealing with it? How are you coping with it? There will be tough days. Is it really an anxiety, or is it like, today is a day that I just need a little bit of a break,
Hmm.
and I need to take some time, and this is how I deal with taking some time to have a balance. Um, in society in general, I think we're seeing a lot more of the need for that balance of like, okay, I'm a little stressed on this end, and it's coming out in these ways. What do I do to pull back so that I can take that breather and reset myself? How do I reset? What are good coping mechanisms to reset? And teaching those good coping mechanisms. Um, a lot of times when parents say that they notice their kids having anxiety, I will tell them, okay, how do you notice? And how do you voice that to your student? How do you voice that to your child? Are you telling them that, I think you're nervous, I think you're anxious? Or are you telling them, I can see within your body that your fists are clenched, you're shaking a lot, you're fidget, you're tapping your legs a lot, you're tapping your fingers. I can see in your body language that there's something going on. What does that feel like for you? What is that? Do you feel the butterflies in your stomach? Okay, how do you cope with that? Let's take some deep breaths. Let's count backwards from 10. Let's do some strategies to cope with that and either calm yourself down, so that the kids can actually name the things that they're feeling and not be told, and things aren't put on them.
Yeah.
And
Go ahead.
no, and I was just saying, and that's a lot of times as adults, we will put more onto it than the kid will. The kid may not even have a name for it or understand what is really happening in their bodies. And so it's up to us to say, okay, this is what I see. This is what this can be. Is that similar to what you're feeling?
Yeah.
Okay, and then how do we cope with that? What are some good, healthy coping mechanisms for that?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I always, as a school administrator, I always ran into was a lot of kids don't necessarily think that people listen to them. We're so busy telling them things that we forget to listen, and just sometimes asking, so what's going on with you? Or,
Mm-hmm.
help me understand, where you're at right now, and leaving that door kind of open for them to start to identify their own feelings, identify their own whatever is going on with them. I think not a lot of there's not enough um, specific teaching about how to name your feelings,
Mm-hmm.
let alone how to then have a conversation with someone about what I'm feeling, where it's coming from, and then for on further. I know that I my own kids are highly anxious. I have two highly anxious kids. And for the life of me, I didn't even understand that until my youngest son was diagnosed with anxiety. And I was diagnosed with anxiety. And then I began to see, like, oh, okay, this is how this feedback loop works.
Mm-hmm.
But until someone told us, um, and told me, I didn't understand that. So I always get, when kids seem to be really literate about what's going on, I sometimes wonder um, where that's coming from, if that is just their coping strategy for trying to figure out what the it is, and
Mm-hmm.
not necessarily go into that label, not necessarily double down into that. I think bullying is a really good example. Is, oh, I've been bullied. Well, is are you going back and forth? Are you having a disagreement with somebody? Oh, yeah,
Right.
yeah, yeah. They said this and I said that. I'm like, okay, then you're not being bullied. You're having a conflict. But
Right.
like, that language is really muddled in our society today because it's coming from everywhere. And you can look it up on your phone, you can look it up, you can watch TikTok about it, and those
Mm-hmm.
kinds of things. So I think,
And
go ahead.
hmm I'm sorry. And everything is a mental health disorder nowadays. It's like you said, it's so muddled. Every time someone has a meltdown
Yeah.
or quote unquote, I don't want to call it a temper tantrum, but it's almost like an adult temper tantrum.
I'm seeing, yes, I
We're
in my
calling
head I
that
call them temper tantrums. I'm sorry.
right, and we're saying, oh, they have a mental health disorder,
Mhm.
and so they get it out, and it's like not everything is mental health. Some things are just that you didn't learn how to cope with that. You didn't learn how to build resilience to that. And and as a society, we need to learn a better way of instilling that in human beings. like as a school, we're not turning out just like little cogs and workers. We're turning out human beings who we want to contribute to a better society.
Right. You made a perfect segue. So, how do we, as a society, as parents, as educators, how do we help kids build that resilience? How do we ourselves build that resilience? Because the world is shifting underneath us.
Hmm.
And a lot of people who have typically done very well and thought of themselves as being very successful are having to reassess that, particularly with the dynamics that are going on in our political and society. So what do you think are some things that people can do?
Ooh, those are heavy questions. You brought in the politics, you brought in the society, all of that. Um, the the biggest thing that we can do is naming it as there are coping things that we do to cope with everyday life.
Right.
Yes, the world is doing what the world is going to do, but I have no control over the world outside of me,
Right.
outside of my sphere of influence. I can control my day-to-day events to some extent.
Right.
And so I think narrowing it down and turning off the news sometimes, turning off the social media sometimes, and those outside influences that heightened heighten the cause or heighten the concern, and saying, here's what we have control over, here's what we can cope with as a family or as a parent, as a student, your child. Here's what you have control over, sweetheart. Here's what you can do within your daily routine. Let's set some goals. We want to go to school. Your job is to go to school, try, learn something new, you know, come home, contribute to the household in some kind of way where you're, helping with dinner. These are the things. Be an athlete, be an artist, be in whatever activity you've chosen to do in your field, and taking that time to like build that resilience within your student of like, I can do these things within my power and within my control. And then being honest about, there are times where things are going to get out of whack and things are going to get unbalanced, and saying, okay, how do we reset that? How do we shift? And how do we handle when things are unbalanced? Do we take a break? Do we, we name it, and we build connections with other people around us and say, okay, I'm unable to, as a parent, manage my kid for these 2 hours today. I have a friend who doesn't have any kids, and they're willing to take my kids for those 2 hours, and being okay with that.
Yeah.
Or, or as a student saying, you know what, I can't do any more homework tonight. We've been working on this for 3 hours, and saying to your parents like, can we stop? You know, one night of homework is not going to break your child down, and they're never going to read, and they're never going to be able to do math, and they're
Right.
never going to be able to write. Taking that time to say, okay, we've done enough of this, let's put it away for now, and not creating those levels of anxiety in your student because you have this fear. And anxiety stems from a fear of the unknown, a fear of
Right.
what if, a fear of like, what, well, they're not going to be a good student. They're not going to be a good mather. They're not going to be a good speller. They're never going to read. They're in kindergarten. If they're not, they're in kindergarten. And if they're not reading by the end of kindergarten, it's a lot of times it's okay.
Yeah.
It's okay. It's not necessarily a disability.
Well,
Um,
and I think
and
I think
you said some other things, but and I'm
you,
sure I've talked all around them.
no, you've done really well. No, not a problem. I think like a couple of things that you said that was striking to me, and we've kind of traded some articles back and forth that we can both reference. And one of them talked about looking at the broader context and keeping a long-term perspective, that this whatever's happening might just be temporary. It's not, it doesn't
Hmm.
define you, and it isn't who you are. And I think like as an administrator, I've tried to focus a lot of my conversations with kids around, I might have to send you home because I suspended you, but this doesn't define who you are. This is this doesn't
Hmm.
determine what you can do, and this doesn't have to follow you. I know for secondary specifically, lots of parents are concerned about the permanent record, and I've had to. It's incredible. I remember being in school and worrying about my permanent record, and the record that goes with you between high school and pre K through 12, that goes to the colleges, is your grades and your
Right.
test scores. And those are
Right.
the only two pieces of information that colleges give, unless you have an IEP. But even then, that's something you and your parents share, not necessarily that the school will share with that next institution. So I think this notion of, and again, social media, I think this notion of everything being permanent and every moment counting has
Hmm.
really warped our sense of what is real and what is not real.
Hmm. You made a good point there. Just that viewpoint of everything follows me.
Right.
And it's becoming more and more prevalent in our society because of social media. So everything that I do, every area of my life is on the big screen. And everybody's going to know everything that has happened in my life. And that in and of itself creates a level of anxiety. Uh,
Absolutely.
because I mean, I can think about the things that I did when I was a teenager. I'm about to be 46, and thank goodness there weren't cell phones with cameras and social media. But at the same time, keeping a positive outlook. Things work out the way they're supposed to work out for the most part. And yes, there are some things that you can do that can change your life tremendously, but for the most part, most of our students aren't getting involved in that. They're not going to, like you said, that they got suspended for a day, for 2 days, 3 days. When you come back, it's a whole new day.
Right.
Sure. And I'm looking at you. I'm not looking at what you did. I'm looking at how we're moving forward from what you did. What did you learn from that? Where can we go from this? It was a mistake. You are a child. You're supposed to make mistakes, and learn from them. We're adults and we're still making mistakes and
Absolutely.
learning from and hopefully learning from them.
Right. And I think that's where like restorative practices come into
Hmm.
play as being an important part of that reentry, because you do have to restore that relationship, or repair that harm, whatever it was, whether it was theft or, yelling and
Hmm.
screaming or whatever that was, being able to repair that, to say, I messed up, I'm sorry, XYZ was going on, and being in creating a space where that is okay to do, and part of the culture of how we cope with these situations and how we move forward is really, really important.
Hmm. A lot of times, I can remember working with a kid who is having a bad day, and
Hmm.
he he was wearing a hoodie all day,
Hmm.
and he did. And the school rule is you don't wear a hoodie around school. And he was told to take it off. He wouldn't take it off, and then some other kid snatched it off his head, and he got mad
Yeah.
and responded in the wrong way. Ended up in the dean of students office, and would not talk to the dean of student about anything that was going on, had shut down completely, head down, hoodie back on, and refusing to answer any questions. And so the dean called me, and because I had a relationship with the student outside of school as well as inside of school.
Hmm.
And I just happened to be there, a fourth grader, and called me in. And so I took one look at the student and I was like, okay, this is different.
Hmm.
Um, let's go talk. And just took him out of the room, took him out of the setting of the dean, even though he normally he's fine with the dean, but took him
Right.
out of that setting and asked what's going on. And he's like nothing, and it was like okay, you're saying nothing, but what I'm seeing is that there's clearly something going on.
Right.
You're crying. Your body is very tense. You won't look at anybody. Clearly something has happened. And
Right.
in order for us to help you, you need to tell us. And he spilled it all out. And then it was like, now, take a deep breath. Was that all that tough? No, it wasn't that tough. Okay, now you've created this big thing in your mind about what this was going to be and how this was going to play out. And it's never played out that way for you before. And a lot of times I think we forget that kids are that's what kids do. That's what humans do. We as adults, if we are having a conflict, and like you said, that restorative piece has to happen because you have to restore the person to themselves, restore them to the community, and restore them to the person that was hurt, to
Right.
each other, because otherwise it becomes fractured. And so they have to feel okay within themselves in order to be restored even within the community. And that's where it starts. And it starts with that whole building up the whole person kind of thing and breaking that. Aspire has this theory of breaking the school to prison pipeline, and it's like popped in my head as I said, restoring the person to themselves first before
Hmm.
you can restore them to a community or restore them to a well community. If they don't believe themselves that they, in themselves that they are worthy of being restored, then there's always going to be this fractured piece coming back into the community, and it can cause all kinds of havoc.
Absolutely. It's funny. We didn't talk about this before, but we've kind of gone into that realm that I have a lot of personal attachment to, and it's this notion of so many of the times when I've dealt with kids who are in trouble or in crisis, it's they have this low opinion of themselves. I remember sitting across from a girl who said to me, well, when I turn 18, I'm probably going to make the news, and not for a good reason. And she was 14 years old, and she had this nihilistic view of her future. And I was like, you are gorgeous. You are smart. School isn't necessarily your school work isn't necessarily your thing right now, but we've got to get you in some classes that, where we can help you develop that thing. There's no reason why you're going to not make it past 18, or not be able to go on and do things that you really want to do with your life. But it's really hard to get through with kids who've had a lot of prior traumas, who've never had that restorative, they've never been in a situation that has been embracing.
Mm-hmm.
They've gone from one issue to another, and that's their own self-image is, oh, I'm a bad kid, or I'm gonna be a bad kid, or I mean, my own example is I always thought I was gonna go to jail. I don't know why, but I was convinced that I was going to go to jail for some reason. I was going to somehow break a law and end up in prison. And and how do you communicate past that?
Mm-hmm. And that's really tough because when I always tell the administrators and the teachers are like, although the kids spend the majority of their day, the majority of those 24 hours in a school,
Hmm.
a good majority of their week in a school, not day, but a week in a school, and they see us a lot of times way more than they see their parents.
Right.
That home environment still has the biggest influence on a student. And if there's trauma there, if there's anxiety there, if there's brokenness there, and there's, you know, examples there of not being able to cope, not being able to deal, they bring all of that to the school.
Yeah, absolutely.
They bring all of that into your classroom. And if you're not looking at that child as a whole person and saying, I'm working with a whole person, not just the part of the brain that deals with reading. I'm just working with math. I'm just working with writing. You're dealing with every emotion and every, component of that child throughout the day. And you have to, as an educator, be built up yourself to be able to do that day in, day out.
Yeah, it's true. I think education has the the role that educators play has shifted from just conveyors of information and knowledge to really being, very humanistic or very human centered,
Hmm.
because we are dealing with com-
Hmm.
the complexity that our kids are bringing to school anymore is so much more than we were ever taught to deal with. And
Hmm.
I get like, I want to be clear and say I don't necessarily think that um where we are as a society and what we're asking educators to do is fair or right or just, because I do think that a lot is put on the school system that is not designed to handle and not resourced to handle either. But I do recognize that the work of educating other people has become a different set of responsibilities and requirements than it was even 20 years ago, because our populations are changing, because we're having a lot more diversity within what our kids are bringing into the classroom, not from just a racial or cultural or even language perspective, but just what their experiences have been and where they've been, and what they've been
Hmm.
exposed to, let alone what they've been exposed to on these wonderful little devices. So
Exactly.
I think it's just we've got to start working together so that we can link arms and take care of ourselves
Hmm.
as well as the children, and help their parents to take care of them, as well as help their kids to be successful academically, because I think we all want the same thing, we just don't necessarily know how to get there together.
Exactly. You hit on a point that something that, and it's this vision dream of mine that I've always wanted, and I don't know if it's the right answer or not, but um, what is called community schooling,
Yeah.
community schools, and I think it's a great idea because where does a child go other than the doctor? From 0 to 5, they go family, doctor, and then 5, they're in the school. And the easiest point of access for any family, any student, is the school system. And so if we have community schools where there's almost this sense of a one-stop shopping kind of model where medical, school, mental health, community resources all work together within that one system, it alleviates a lot of those concerns. It helps the family, not just the child, but the whole family. And in terms, if you change a family, you change a society, change a neighborhood, you change a community. And so, what better place to do that than in the schools? Like the schools and having those partnerships with those community resources, medical, business, mental health, unemployment, all of that. if it was all available within one area where parents have to, because you have to bring your kid to school
Right.
in the United States, there's no getting, well, there is now, there are other options, but there's no getting around. There's homeschooling and all of these other varieties of the types of schools you go to, but every child has to receive some form of education
Right. Right.
and have some point of direction within a school system. So,
And I'm actually, it's so funny because I actually have that same desire to see more community schooling. And I think, I think elementaries and kindergartens and elementaries and preschools do a really good job of being really communally focused. But again, when they get up to secondary and the student to teacher ratio just shifts. The
mhm,
shift of responsibility and accountability also shifts. So, I mean, I want to acknowledge that's a systemic issue that no one person can solve. But I think one solving of that issue is to make it smaller, to bring community back in, and to work closer together so that
mhm.
we can meet the tremendous amount of needs that all people have. I mean, you have needs, I have needs, and we're not necessarily always well equipped or even knowledgeable at how to get those needs met.
Exactly, yes. And I mean, even as an adult, being able to access those community resources within that community school would be helpful for the
Right.
employees. Um,
Absolutely.
a lot of times, the employees need that moment to say, okay, I don't know how to handle this. I don't have this in my tool belt, but I do know that Dr. So and so, who is a pediatrician, does, or the LCSW, who's working with us, does, or can reach out and help the family with these things because this parent came to me because they trust me, but I have this resource, and this resource that I can connect with.
Yeah, I think that is that would be hopefully where we're going in the next 20 years.
Whew, again, education moves slow.
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. Yes, it does. Well, before we kind of wrap up, is there any kind of last thoughts or things that you wanted to share that we hadn't touched upon?
I know we kind of like touched on a lot. I
Yes.
have visions and I have dreams about education and things that I think should be happening. But I think we touched on a lot of different things around just resilience
Mhm.
and coping and being able to teach the students more about what is happening within themselves and to be able to cope with that. And I think the schools are doing a greater job because there's a greater need.
Mhm.
And so, and I think a lot more entities are recognizing that, political, business as well. And there's like, oh, we're doing more mental health in the school. We want to put more money towards mental health in the schools because we're turning out students that are going out and doing these things that that affect a whole society. And so, and when you dwell back into their past, you're like, oh, we saw this trigger, we saw this thing and this thing and this thing, or we didn't see it at all. And it's like, how did people miss these things? Or if they didn't miss it, what happened within the system to break down to not get that student the help that they needed and the level of support that they needed? And so I think leaving from here, it's something that parents have to be willing to talk about. It's something that educators have to be willing to talk about. It's something that our leaders in society have to be willing to talk about, that that there's a need within our schooling systems that is not being met.
Yeah.
And and it's not due to the fault of the students. A lot of times due to the fault of the adults because we haven't learned to cope with our own issues, and we haven't, or if we have learned to cope, sometimes it's an unhealthy coping, and recognize what we're going through, or even being able to reach out and get the resources that we need to get. And so a lot of that's passed down
Yeah.
to the kid, and then they come to a breaking point, and we get these societal issues that happen or these great tragedies that are happening. And it's like, well, how did people miss that? Where were the teachers? Where were the educators? Where were the parents?
So what I'm hearing you saying is, instead of playing the blame game,
Mhm.
which I think is a lot of what folks are doing right now in a lot of different ways. Just being able to say, okay, we have an issue. Let's face that issue as we see it and start to try to figure out what we can do to address it. And if we
Mhm.
don't know what the next steps are, be willing to say, I don't know, and work together to come up
Mhm.
with that solution. And not everyone has the answer, but to collectively, we can come up with the answer together.
Right. Because it surpasses race, it surpasses gender, it surpasses socioeconomic status, all of that. It's not a black white issue. It's not a rich poor issue. It's us. It's a
Human
society,
issue, right?
society, yeah, human issue, and we have to figure out and how to be proactive and preventative rather than reactive.
I like that. Proactive and preventative, and rather than reactive.
Hmm.
Awesome. Well, I think we, as you said, we've touched on a lot of different things, which I really, really appreciate. Thank you so much for your time today, Dr. Granderson.
Thank you,
This
Dr. Nyberg.
this has been episode 10 of Uncommon Voices and Uncommon Visions, and I'm your host, Dr. Valerie Nyberg. Thank you so much for joining us. Please feel free to like, share, or comment, and we'll see you next time. Thank you so
See
much.
you next time.